The thermometer at Dubai International Airport reads 43 degrees. The number that matters reads 62. Both are correct. The 43 is the air temperature, what a thermometer in the shade measures. The 62 is the heat index, and it is not a dramatization or a figure of speech. It is a calculated estimate of the temperature your body actually experiences once you account for the one thing a plain thermometer ignores: the water in the air. On July 17, 2024, Dubai's airport recorded an air temperature of 43 degrees Celsius alongside a dew point of 85 degrees Fahrenheit, a measure of how much moisture the atmosphere was holding. Feed those two values into the United States National Weather Service Heat Index, and the result is 144 degrees Fahrenheit, 62 Celsius. 3 days later, on July 20th, the same station produced the same reading. The air said 43. Your body would have experienced 62. That gap, 19 degrees between what the instrument reads and what a human feels, is the entire subject of this video. Because feels like is one of the most misunderstood phrases in weather reporting. People hear it as opinion, as exaggeration, as the forecaster being dramatic. It is none of those things. It is a physiological measurement, and understanding what it measures tells you exactly where the human body stops working, why it stops there, and the deeply uncomfortable fact that this specific threshold has already been crossed on Earth, including inside this country. Start with what a heat index actually is, because almost nobody knows. The concept comes from a 1979 model by a scientist named Robert Stedman, who asked a precise question given a certain air temperature and a certain humidity. What temperature would it need to be in dry conditions to feel the same to a human body? He built an equation around human physiology, sweat rates, skin temperature, the resistance of clothing, the rate at which a body can shed heat. The output is the heat index, sometimes called apparent temperature. The key insight built into that equation is this: your body does not care what the air temperature is. It cares whether it can get rid of heat. And how much heat it can shed depends far more on humidity than on the number a thermometer shows. So the heat index is not measuring the air. It is estimating you. It is an answer to the question: how hot is your body being forced to run right now? At 43 degrees air with dry conditions, the Phoenix or Riyadh version, the heat index sits close to the air temperature because your sweat is evaporating freely and cooling you efficiently. At 43 degrees air with a Gulf dew point, the heat index leaps to 62 because your sweat has nowhere to go. Same thermometer reading. Radically different event happening inside your body. To see why humidity matters that much, you have to understand that above a certain point your body has only one cooling system left, and humidity is the single variable that decides whether it works. Your body runs at 37 degrees. It sheds heat to the environment 4 ways: radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation. The first 3 all depend on the air being cooler than your skin. Your skin sits around 35 degrees, so the moment the air climbs past 35, which in Dubai is most of the day for 4 months of the year, those 3 systems don't just weaken, they reverse. Air hotter than your skin deposits heat into you. You become the thing being warmed. That leaves evaporation. Sweat, evaporation is a genuinely powerful cooling mechanism. Converting 1 gram of water from liquid to vapor absorbs about 580 calories of heat, and it pulls that energy straight out of your skin. A well-adapted person can sweat 1 to 2 liters an hour and shed enormous amounts of heat doing it. But evaporation has one requirement that nothing can work around. The water has to have somewhere to go. It has to be able to leave your skin and enter the air. And air that is already near saturated with moisture cannot accept any more. That is what humidity does. It fills the air with water until there is no room left for yours. Your sweat emerges, sits on your skin, and does nothing. You are losing fluid, salt and blood volume, everything evaporation costs, and receiving none of the cooling it is supposed to buy. Your last remaining system is switched on and producing nothing. Here is what that actually feels like from the inside, because the physiology has a felt sequence. In the first stage, you simply feel hot and you sweat heavily, and your skin stays wet rather than drying. the first sign that evaporation has stalled. Your heart rate climbs because your body is trying to move more blood to the skin to compensate for cooling that isn't happening. Then comes the heaviness. Limbs feel loaded. Effort feels disproportionate because your circulation is being pulled in two directions at once. Thirst arrives late and unreliably, well after you are already dehydrated. And the final stage, the dangerous one, is the one people miss, a subtle confusion, a loss of the judgment that would tell you to stop. By the time the body is in real trouble, the organ that would recognize it is already compromised. None of that requires the air temperature to be spectacular. It only requires the air to be unable to take your sweat. This is why the Gulf is uniquely dangerous, and why 62 is Dubai's real summer number rather than 43. The Arabian Gulf is extraordinarily shallow, averaging around 35 meters deep. A deep ocean absorbs summer heat and carries it down into cold water below. The Gulf cannot. It heats through its whole depth like a shallow tray. By July, its surface routinely exceeds 33 degrees, and in places climbs past 35. That enormous warm surface evaporates continuously, and the prevailing winds carry that moisture-laden air directly over the coastal cities. Humidity along the UAE coast regularly reaches 85%. There is a reason the Gulf, specifically, keeps appearing at the top of every list of the most dangerous humid heat locations on the planet, ahead of the Amazon, ahead of South Asia, ahead of the American Gulf Coast. It is nearly enclosed, connected to the open ocean only through the narrow Strait of Hormuz, so its water cannot easily exchange with cooler seas beyond. It sits at a latitude that receives punishing direct summer sun. It is ringed by desert that radiates additional heat, and it is shallow enough to cook through completely. Almost every other hot region on Earth has an escape valve, a deep ocean, a monsoon, a cooler current, a night that actually cools. The Gulf has none of them. It is close to a perfect machine for manufacturing lethal humid heat, and the cities on its shore were built, mostly within living memory, directly on top of it. So Dubai gets the worst possible combination: air hot enough to reverse 3 of your 4 cooling channels, and humidity high enough to disable the 4th. The 43 on the thermometer is almost the least important number in that equation. The 62 is the honest one. Now here is where we reach the number in the title of this video, the point at which the body genuinely gives up, and it is not 62. Because the heat index, useful as it is, has an upper limit as a communication tool. Once conditions get extreme enough, climate scientists stop talking about heat index and switch to a more fundamental measurement: the wet bulb temperature. The name is literal. Wrap a wet cloth around the bulb of a thermometer and spin it through the air. Water evaporates off the cloth and cools the bulb, a lot in dry air, barely at all in humid air. The reading you get is the lowest temperature that evaporation alone can achieve under those exact conditions. That instrument is a model of you. A human body cooling itself by sweat is doing exactly what that wet cloth is doing. So the wet bulb temperature tells you the coldest your body can possibly get by sweating. And if that number climbs too high, sweating cannot cool you below a survivable temperature no matter how much you sweat. In 2010, 2 climate scientists, Stephen Sherwood and Matthew Huber, calculated where that hard limit sits. They modeled the human body in its most survivable possible configuration, unclothed, at rest, fully heat acclimatized, sitting in the shade with air moving over it, and asked at what wet bulb temperature even that idealized person could no longer shed heat. 35 degrees. At a wet bulb temperature of 35, skin temperature and wet bulb temperature converge. The gradient your body uses to push heat outward disappears. Evaporation stops cooling you because the air is as wet as your skin is. Core temperature begins to rise and does not stop, and their calculation put the time to fatal at roughly 6 hours for the idealized best-case human. For anyone real, sooner. To connect it back to the number you know, a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees corresponds to a heat index of roughly 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Dubai's 62 degree feels like 144 Fahrenheit sits below that in the range scientists already classify as severe, which begins at a wet bulb of just 30 degrees. So Dubai in July is not routinely at the theoretical death line. It operates in the band just beneath it, the band labeled severe, for months at a time. But the theoretical death line is exactly where this stops being theoretical. For years, the 35-degree wet bulb threshold was discussed as a future problem. Climate models projected the first occurrences around the middle of this century. Then, in 2020, a team led by Colin Raymond at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory with Tom Matthews and Radley Horton did something the models hadn't. They went through the actual raw records from thousands of individual weather stations back to 1979, not smooth regional averages, but specific instruments at specific locations, hour by hour. They found that the 35-degree wet bulb threshold had already been reached, not in the future, in the record. Brief spikes to 35 degrees or above had occurred at least 14 times since 1979, and the frequency of extreme humid heat overall had more than doubled in those 4 decades. And the places where it happened form a very short list. Jacobabad in Pakistan, Jeddah and Dhahran in Saudi Arabia. The Dhahran reading on July 8, 2003, had stood informally as the highest such value ever recorded. And Ras Al Khaimah. Ras Al Khaimah is in the United Arab Emirates. It is roughly an hour up the coast from where you are watching this. One of the small handful of places on the entire planet where a human body's absolute survivability limit has actually been recorded by an instrument is not in some abstract future. It is in this country, and it has already happened. Every one of those spikes lasted only an hour or two, not the full 6 hours the fatal model assumes. And every one traced back to the same mechanism: Gulf Sea surface temperatures pushing past 35 degrees, and that superheated, saturated air blowing onshore. The exact mechanism described earlier in this video is not hypothetical. It has already, briefly, produced conditions at the edge of human survivability along this coastline. The closest brush the world had before that study came in 2015. On July 31st, a weather station in Bandar Mashar, Iran, on the northern shore of the same Gulf, recorded a wet bulb temperature just short of 35 degrees. There were no known deaths, and the reason there were no deaths tells you everything about what actually determines who survives modern extreme heat. Residents reported staying inside air-conditioned vehicles and buildings, and showering after brief trips outside. The heat reached the limit of what a body can tolerate, and people survived it by never fully being in it. Which brings us to the most important correction in this entire subject, and the reason the phrase "the temperature at which the body gives up" cannot be a single fixed number. The 35-degree figure assumes the best-case human, young, healthy, naked, resting, in shade, fully acclimatized, with air moving over the skin. Almost nobody experiencing real heat is that person. In 2023, a team led by Ollie J. at the University of Sydney rebuilt the calculation using real human data, actual sweat rate limits, the effects of age, the load of direct sun, the reality of clothing and exertion. Their finding was that the true limit for real people is often considerably lower than 35 and varies enormously from person to person. And the most devastating evidence for that came the following year, 400 kilometers from here. During the 2024 Hajj pilgrimage in Mecca, between the 14th and 19th of June, at least 1,901 people died of heat. The wet bulb temperature over those 6 days peaked at 29.5 degrees. Not 35. 29.5, comfortably inside the merely severe band, more than 5 degrees below the theoretical death line. And 1,301 people died anyway, because they were elderly, or unwell, or clothed, or walking 6 to 21 kilometers a day in direct sun, or all of those at once. Researchers analyzing the event found the true limits of human tolerance were breached for a cumulative 43 hours, despite the wet bulb never approaching 35. So the honest answer to what temperature the human body gives up at is this: lower than the famous number, different for every person, and already exceeded, both at the theoretical limit in Ras Al Khaimah and in lethal practice in Mecca. The 35-degree line was never the point at which people start dying. It is the point at which even a perfect body, doing everything right, cannot survive. People give up long before it, in enormous numbers. For a working body, the margin is thinner still, because your own metabolism is fighting against you the entire time. Even at complete rest, doing nothing, your body generates around 100 kilocalories of waste heat every hour, just keeping you alive. If your cooling systems are producing nothing, as they do in saturated air, that internal heat alone raises your core temperature by roughly 1.1 degrees per hour. Physical labor can push heat production above 1,000 kilocalories an hour, 10 times faster. You cross from 37 into heat stroke territory at 40 in a matter of hours at rest, and far less under load. The heat index of 62 is not describing an external threat pressing in on you. It is describing the failure of your ability to vent a fire you are carrying inside you at all times. That is why the feels like number, not the air temperature, is the one that predicts who ends up in a hospital. It is the only one of the two that accounts for whether your body can actually cool itself. And the danger does not begin at the fatal line. This is the part of the Raymond study that gets least attention and matters most for daily life. Values far below 35 already carry serious health and productivity consequences. Long before humid heat kills you, it makes work impossible. Physical labor becomes dangerous, then unproductive, then simply cannot be done. The researchers describe a future in which, across large populated regions, economic activity is forced to shift into the night simply because the daytime becomes physiologically unusable, not in some distant scenario, but as a direct extension of trends already visible in the record. A city that can only work at night is not a hypothetical. It is the logical endpoint of a place where the feels like temperature sits in the severe band for a third of the year. And the Gulf is closer to that endpoint than anywhere else on Earth. This is also why access to cooling has become, quite literally, the line between living and dying in the modern Gulf, and why that line is drawn unevenly. Bandar Mashar survived its brush with the limit because people had air conditioning to retreat into. Most of the 1,101 who died at the Hajj did not. Around 83% were unauthorized pilgrims without permits, and therefore without the hotel rooms, official transport, and air-conditioned shelters that were available to registered pilgrims. Same heat. Survival sorted by who had somewhere cool to go. The UAE understands this better than almost anywhere, which is why it runs one of the most institutionalized heat protection systems on Earth. The midday work ban, formerly the Occupational Heat Stress Prevention Policy, has operated every summer since 2004 and is now in its 22nd consecutive year. From June 15th to September 15th, no outdoor work in direct sun is permitted between 12:30 and 3:00 in the afternoon. 93 consecutive days, weekends, and holidays included. Employers face fines of 5,000 dirhams per worker in violation, up to 50,000, and are expected to monitor conditions on site. More than 12,000 air-conditioned rest stations have been built for delivery riders alone. It is a serious system, built by people who know exactly what the numbers in this video mean. But it is built around a clock, and the heat does not follow a clock. The ban lifts at 3 p.m. because 3 p.m. is enforceable. Air temperature on a Gulf summer day typically peaks between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, and ground surface temperatures, the heat radiating off asphalt and steel, often peak later still. The worker who steps back onto a site at 3:01 is frequently stepping into conditions harder than the ones the rule just shielded them from. And the pressure on that system is set to increase. The National Center of Meteorology has forecast a 98% probability of El Niño conditions from now through November. El Niño matters here for a specific local reason. It is historically associated with a weakening of the northwesterly Shimal winds, the one natural mechanism that ventilates this coast in summer by pushing drier northern air down over the Gulf. When the Shimal weakens, the humid coastal air stops moving. It sits. And the gap between the thermometer and the body, the gap between 43 and 62, grows wider. 3 questions come out of all of this. If the theoretical survivability limit has already been touched at Ras Al Khaimah, and lethal humid heat already killed 1,201 people well below that limit in a neighboring country, what is the actual wet bulb value that should trigger a full outdoor shutdown across the Gulf, and why is that number nowhere in public policy? The UA's midday break ends at 3 o'clock for reasons of enforcement, not physiology. What would the rule look like if it ended when the wet bulb temperature dropped, instead of when the clock struck 3? And as Gulf Sea surface temperatures climb one more degree, and the Shamal weakens one more El Nino season, how many more of those brief? Hour-long spikes to the survivability limit does this coastline see? And what happens the first time one of them lasts not 1 hour, but 6? Nobody has published an answer to any of them. As of 5 o'clock this afternoon, the 25th of July, Dubai International Airport is reporting 41 degrees Celsius with humidity at 27%. The heat index, the feels like, the number that describes your body rather than the air, sits at 43. A mild day by local standards, and mild only because the Shamal is still blowing and the humidity is low. That is the entire reason the two numbers are close together today. Offshore, the Gulf is holding above 33 degrees and will not cool meaningfully until November. Tonight, the air in the city will not drop below 31, which means the recovery window your body relies on overnight will barely open. And somewhere up the coast sits Ras Al Khaimah, an ordinary town with an ordinary weather station that has, on a small number of days, quietly recorded the temperature at which the human body simply gives up. The thermometer will tell you it is 41 degrees out there. Your body would tell you something different. The difference between those two numbers is made entirely of water in the air, and in this part of the world, that difference is the whole story of whether a person walks back indoors at the end of a shift or doesn't. The thermometer measures the air. The wet bulb measures you. Learn to watch the second one